Welcome to another episode of History of the Popes, where we delve into the lives and legacies of the successors of St. Peter, exploring their roles in shaping the Church and the world. Today we focus on Pope Linus, the second Pope, a figure often overshadowed by the towering presence of Peter, but one whose tenure offers a fascinating glimpse into the nascent Christian community in Rome. Historians approach Linus not with hagiographic embellishment, but with a careful eye toward the limited yet intriguing sources we have, aiming to understand his place in the early Church's development. Let's step back into the 1st century and uncover the story of Linus, a man who, tradition holds, carried the weight of apostolic succession in a time of peril and promise. To begin, we must acknowledge the scarcity of definitive information about Linus. The historical record from the 1st century is thin, and what we know comes from a blend of early Christian writings, later traditions, and a bit of scholarly detective work. Linus is traditionally recognized as the immediate successor to St. Peter, serving as Bishop of Rome from roughly 67 or 68 AD to around 76 or 80 AD. These dates are approximate, drawn from early church lists like those of Irenaeus of Lyons and Eusebius of Caesarea, who compiled catalogues of bishops to demonstrate the continuity of apostolic teaching. But these lists, while valuable, were written decades or even centuries later, and their precision is not absolute. As a historian, I'm cautious about treating them as unassailable fact, yet they provide a framework for understanding Linus's place in the timeline. Who was Linus? The earliest reference to him comes from the New Testament itself, specifically 2 Timothy 4:21, where Paul, writing from prison in Rome, sends greetings from several individuals, including someone named Linus. Eubulus greets you, Paul writes, and so do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers. This brief mention is tantalizing. Was this Linus the same man who would become Pope? Early Christian tradition, including Irenaeus in his work against heresies, assumes so, identifying Linus as the one entrusted with the episcopal office after Peter's martyrdom. But the text itself doesn't explicitly say this Linus was a bishop, so we must hold this connection lightly as a probability rather than a certainty. Still, it's a compelling link, suggesting Linus was part of the Christian community in Rome during Paul's final days, a community navigating its identity in the shadow of Nero's persecutions. Let's set the scene. Rome in the late 60s. AD was a city of grandeur and volatility. Nero's reign, marked by extravagance and cruelty, had just unleashed a brutal persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of 64 AD, which many Romans blamed on the new religious sect. Peter, tradition holds, was martyred during this period, likely crucified upside down, as later accounts like the Acts of Peter suggest. Into this fraught environment steps Linus, tasked with leading a community that was small, marginalized, and under threat. The role of Pope, as we understand it today, a centralized monarchical figure, did not yet exist. The early bishops of Rome were more like overseers or elders, guiding local house churches, resolving disputes, and preserving the teachings of the apostles. Linus's leadership would have been pastoral and practical, focused on survival and fidelity to the gospel. What do we know about Linus's background? Frustratingly little. Later traditions like the Liber Pontificalis, a medieval collection of papal biographies, claim Linus was from Tuscany, possibly Volterra, and that he was of Italian descent. But the Liber, compiled centuries later, often blends fact with pious legend, so we can't take this as gospel. More plausibly, Linus was likely a member of Rome's diverse Christian community, which included Jews, Gentiles, slaves, and freedmen. His name, Linus, is Greek in origin, meaning flax or linen, which might suggest a Hellenistic background. But names in Rome were fluid across cultures, so this tells us little definitively. Whether he was a Jew or a Gentile, a local or a migrant, we simply don't know. What matters is that he was trusted enough to assume leadership after Peter, a sign of his standing among the faithful. One question that often arises is what Linus actually did as Pope. Here, we confront the limits of our sources. The early church was not yet a formalized institution with clear bureaucratic roles. Linus's papacy would have involved preaching, teaching, and organizing the community's worship, likely in secret gatherings to avoid Roman authorities. Tradition attributes to him certain decrees, such as requiring women to cover their heads in church, a claim found in the Liber Pontificalis. This echoes Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 11, but there's no contemporary evidence that Linus issued such a rule. It's more likely a later attribution, reflecting practices that became standard in the church by the time the Liber was written. Similarly, some traditions suggest Linus ordained clergy or established early liturgical norms, but these are speculative, shaped by later assumptions about what a pope should do. A more pressing challenge for Linus would have been maintaining unity in a diverse and endangered community. The first-century church in Rome was not a monolith. It included Jewish Christians who emphasized continuity with the law of Moses, and Gentile converts who were less tied to Jewish practices. Tensions between these groups are evident in Paul's letter to the Romans, written a decade earlier, where he urges unity and mutual respect. As bishop, Linus would have mediated these differences, ensuring the community remained cohesive despite theological debates and external pressures. Persecution under Nero had decimated the church's leadership. Peter and Paul were likely both martyred by 67 AD. So Linus's role was also one of rebuilding, fostering resilience in a community that had lost its apostolic founders. Another dimension to consider is Linus's relationship to the broader Christian movement. The church in Rome was not yet the dominant center it would become. Other Christian hubs like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Ephesus were equally vibrant. Yet Rome's significance was growing, partly because of its status as the empire's capital, and partly because of the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, which gave the Roman Church a unique prestige. Linus, as Peter's successor, would have been a point of contact for other Christian communities, though we have no letters or records from him to confirm this. His leadership likely focused inward, on stabilizing the Roman Church, rather than outward, on asserting authority over others. How did Linus die? Tradition holds that he was martyred, a claim repeated in sources like the Liber Pontificalis and some martyrologies which say he was beheaded for his faith. But this is not corroborated by earlier sources like Irenaeus or Eusebius, who are silent on his death. The idea of Linus's martyrdom may reflect a later tendency to assume all early popes died as martyrs, a pattern that fits the heroic narrative of the persecuted church. It's possible Linus died a natural death, though given the climate of intermittent persecution, martyrdom is not implausible. Without clearer evidence, we must leave this question open, acknowledging the courage it took to lead a Christian community in such a time, whether or not it ended in a violent death. What can we say about Linus's legacy? In many ways, his significance lies in his position as a bridge between Peter and the later bishops who would shape the papacy. He represents continuity, the handing on of apostolic tradition in a time of crisis. The early church's survival in Rome, despite persecution and internal challenges, is itself a testament to leaders like Linus who, however obscure, kept the flame of faith alive. By the time of his successor, Anacletus, or Cletus, the Roman Church was gaining strength, laying the groundwork for its eventual primacy. As we reflect on Linus, we're reminded of the fragility and resilience of the early church. He was not a towering figure like Peter or a prolific writer like Paul, but his quiet leadership in a turbulent time was no less vital. The sources we have, sparse, fragmented, and sometimes embellished, invite us to approach him with humility, piecing together what we can while respecting the gaps in our knowledge. Linus challenges us to appreciate the unsung figures of history, those who labor in the shadows to sustain a movement greater than themselves. That brings us to the end of today's episode on Pope Linus, the second pope, a man of faith in a time of trial. Next time, we'll explore his successor, Anacletus, and the continued growth of the early church. Until then, thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the popes. Keep exploring, and we'll meet again soon.